I'd be sorry for the way everything has been held up on your account. Just to remind you that there's a certain book here that I have, and a few other people have bought it here by Francis, and it's available in the shops, so I kind of plug in. Without any further ado, I'm going to introduce you tonight to Frances McGee, who has retired about 5 years, is that right, from the National Archives. And in that time, she's put in a lot of good work, and certainly that book is testimony to your time there. And due to the fire drill, I won't say any more, just let you go on. Ladies and gentlemen, Frances.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here on a cold evening like today. And first I want to say thank you also to the National Archives, who gave me some of the images and who provided various facilities for me doing the work on this.
Is that okay?
I'm going to talk first about the background to the valuation, and then I'm going to look at some examples of how these documents can be used. Now, many of you will be very familiar with Griffith's valuation, or the primary valuation, because this is a printed source that's widely available. It's the best known of all the valuation records, and many people think that this is the only valuation record that there is, but in fact this is a very small percentage of the total quantity of valuation records. But it's popular, it's usable, it's legible, it's a good starting point for further research. It's also available online, it's indexed, it's searchable, and it's a great help. Like, you're starting at the end if you start working with the printed valuation, with the primary valuation, but it's a great help for working backwards. But I'll come back to it now later in the talk. But the first question is really, what is the valuation? And the valuation was a survey that covered every piece of land in the country between 1830 and 1865. And the initial valuation at this period, 1830 to 65, it created the base valuation that then became the base document, which was updated continuously from that time until rates on domestic houses were abolished in the 1990s. And the valuation office went on valuing certain domestic properties up to the late 1890s, and then they stopped. They still value commercial property. This work created a very large collection of documents that they retained as evidence and that they used. I remember working there in the 1970s and 80s in the office, and the staff were actually consulting documents that had been created in the 1830s, and they were still using them to make valuation certificates. But the archives are now one of the best sources of information on 19th century Ireland, given that there's no census and that there are a lot of baptismal, a lot of church records were lost, and the civil registration of births, marriages and deaths did not start until 1864. Why did they make the valuation? Well, at the time, grand juries, in the early 19th century, grand juries were the precursors of county councils. And grand juries were the local authorities who needed funding to fund their responsibilities, which were roads, bridges, lunatic asylums, fever hospitals. They had various responsibilities like this, bridewells, lockups, and they were funded through a tax known as county cess that was levied on owners of property. Now, we all know, now everybody is a great expert on property tax, and everybody has very strong opinions about property tax. And in the 19th century, it was exactly the same. Everybody had very strong opinions, and for the whole time that the valuation was going on, there was always controversy about the valuation. But the county cess was very unequal and uneven tax. It was based on a rate per acre, but statute acres as a standard measure did not come in until 1824. It was applied to Ireland in 1824. So an acre in one county meant one thing, and an acre in another county meant something else. So you could be living in a property adjoining somebody who was paying far less or far more than you were, and there was constant controversy about this. It was discussed in Grattan's Parliament. After the Act of Union, there were several attempts to solve this, through parliamentary committees, through select committees in the House of Commons in London. And in other countries, this was, at the time, property was recognised as being a very good source of income for the authorities. So in other countries, they were doing these cadastral surveys based on maps. But the problem there was that you needed a reliable map, and there was no reliable map. So the solution to all of this was a national valuation. And in 1824, there was a committee, a select committee that became known as the Spring Rice Committee, after Spring Rice was a Kerry landlord who was chairman of this committee. He later became Lord Mount Eagle. And out of this committee came three bodies were set up: the Boundary Survey that established the boundaries, the Ordnance Survey who made maps, and the valuation. And those three bodies still exist today. And there was legislation passed in 1826 that set up the valuation, and the valuation was headed by Richard Griffith, who at the time was a well-known mining engineer. There was no engineering enterprise in the country that didn't have Richard Griffith's finger in the pie of some kind. He was building roads for the state. He was looking at mines all over the place. He was consulting people in the UK about mines. And he was a Renaissance man, a very difficult person, and very, very brilliant and clever, but probably not very nice. But anyway, he was made head of the valuation. And he was given more or less a free hand with what he was to do. He was given very sort of vague instructions about what he was to do. He was to value every piece of land in the country. And he developed the method, he developed the valuation as it became. And he was going to make, his instructions were to make a national survey and to make it by a uniform method, and it was going to be done by an independent body. And the independent body was really an effort to keep the grand juries out of this and to stop local interference and to stop, it was an effort to make the whole thing transparent, if you want to use a modern word. And the objective was to determine the rateable valuation, which was going to be the multiplier. We will all, many of us here will remember having rateable valuations on our property, and how that was the multiplier used by the local authority to charge rates. And rates on, the rates in Northern Ireland to valuation has been redone a few times, but it's basically the same principle. You have a valuation on your property and that's what you pay. Now, it was, as I said, it was in continuous controversy, but it was successfully completed. And in the 20th century, like since that time, they have never managed to revalue the whole country in the way in which it was done in the 19th century. And so what I'm talking about here is the initial valuation, where they were making the valuation that became the baseline of what happened subsequently. The work was highly organised. They used rules and instructions. They had a certain amount of material in legislation, and they issued these official instructions about how the work was to take place. The work was done county by county, starting in the north. As the Ordnance Survey maps became available, the Ordnance Survey maps became available first for Derry, then there were parts of Donegal, Antrim, and they worked from north to south. And they sent out teams of valuators. Well, they're now called valuers, but they were called valuators at this time. Valuators and surveyors to do the work on the ground. They went around every parish in county by county. They'd take a barony in the county, work through each parish, and when each parish was finished, move on to the next one. And they worked out of little books, not bigger than that, where they wrote everything down and sent the records back to the office in Dublin, and they're the records that are now in the National Archives. But the fact that they wrote everything down is, they wrote it down because they didn't waste time writing down much that was unnecessary, but they wrote it down because other people were going to have to use it for reference, and the documents themselves were highly organised. And when they were finished, they sent the documents to the office in Dublin, where they did calculations and checking and queries. And they created a draft valuation that was then sent back to the country, and it was posted up, and it could be appealed. Now, this was a bit like a planning appeal. There were sort of certain dates within which things had to happen, and the valuation could be appealed. And then out of the appeal process came the final valuation, which was used for taxation. Now this was a very large project, and because the ground kind of shifted under their feet while this was happening, they were changing the law on the franchise, on people who could be on the electoral register. The law changed during this period, and also the poor law came in 1838, and that created a major change. So things were happening in the background. Also, the laws were changing about the development of towns and small towns, and all of this had an effect on the valuation. So new things kept being introduced. There were a number of acts. I think over the period between 1830 and 1855 or 6, there were 12 different valuation acts. Now, that kind of thing would never happen nowadays, but it showed how much, the extent to which it was experimental, and they needed a different legislative basis for what they were doing. Now, because this was complicated, I'm afraid the documents are complex. So in this period of the initial valuation is really divided into two valuations. There was first a townland valuation, and secondly a tenement valuation. And the townland valuation took place between 1830 and 1852. The tenement valuation started in 1844 and went on to 65, and you can see there's an overlap in that. But the examples I'm going to use are all in County Dublin, and County Dublin is relatively simple, but I will mention these because many of you might be interested in researching other parts of the country. So in the townland valuation, they valued only townlands. They didn't value individual holdings. So they gave the valuation of the entire townland, and then the tax was split up at local level into what you paid and what you paid and what you paid. But the townland, so this does not involve many of the records of the townland valuation do not contain names to the extent that the tenement valuation did, but there are still names there. The work started in mid-1830s, as I said, and worked from north to south, and they had completed 26 counties by the mid-1840s. When this became superseded. Now, in the meantime, in 1838, the poor law had been introduced, and the poor law commissioners, the poor law was literally created on the model. They just reimposed the model of the poor law in England and Wales on Ireland, and they did a separate poor law valuation, was done locally by the boards of guardians. And in some places this was quite well done, and in other places it was acknowledged to be absolutely terrible. So the poor law valuation valued individual tenements, your individual property, whatever it was, a house or a garden or a farm or whatever it was. And so you then had a situation where you had two valuations in force. One was in force for the local authority tax, the county cess, and the other for the poor rate. And this became impossible, and there was a lot of controversy and criticism about this. And in 1844 it was decided that there would only be one valuation, and it would be a tenement valuation. So at that time there were 6 counties that where the valuation hadn't started. There was Dublin because it was complicated, and then there was 5 counties in Munster. There was Cork, Limerick, Kerry, Tipperary and Waterford hadn't been valued. So those 6 counties were only valued once, and all of the other counties were valued twice. So I'll go quickly through the tenement valuation. Valued every tenement and house separately. From 1844, it started in Dublin in 1844 and did the other counties. And then once they had done the counties that were being done for the first time, they went back over the counties that had previously been valued in the townland valuation. And the Act of 1852 was the definitive Valuation Act, and that Act was actually in force until 2001, when it was superseded by a new Valuation Act. And what's the difference in the two valuations? Well, this valuation in townlands, they divided each townland into quality lots of good soil, bad soil, and it didn't matter where the farm boundaries fell in that. Where the tenement valuation valued farms and individual holdings. The townland valuation valued only houses likely to be worth over £5 in value, like fairly decent houses. The tenement valuation valued everything, and the townland valuation named a limited number of occupiers, and where the tenement valuation valued all occupiers. Now, when I say occupiers, I mean head of household would be what they'd be called in census terms. It was the person who paid the rates was the person they were interested in. They'd no interest in the other members of the family. And what do we now have from the valuation? We have a very large archive of documents. The National Archives holds 30,000 documents. Now, when I say documents, I don't mean sheets of paper. Some of them are books that size. So it's a very large quantity of material. The Valuation Office holds the revision documents, which are the continuation from the moment the initial valuation was established. And they started in some places around 1855, and they go up to the present day. And the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland holds valuation documents from the 1830s, because in the early 1920s, a valuation office was set up in Belfast, and the records that they would need for their work were transferred to the valuation office in Belfast, even though some of them got left behind accidentally. And in fact, the National Archives has quite a large quantity of documents that relate to counties in Northern Ireland. And the documents because the documents were always very well organised, because the books were in parishes, they're actually not that difficult to navigate your way through. This is a photograph. I'm sure many of you will have seen these documents. This is just a random box of field books from Waterford. You can see they're about that size, and they vary in thickness. Oh, it's from Wexford actually. But the main series of documents are field books, house books, Quarto books, tenure books, maps, town plans, and the primary valuation, which is the Griffith valuation. And there are other documents that are due to become available in the National Archives once they've been, well, there was talk of digitising them. I'm not really sure what's to happen in that now, but there are documents that can't be made available in the format that they're in at the moment. And what information is in these documents? Well, you've the names and addresses of individuals, and you'll all know how valuable that is. You can tell the location, the extent, and the quality of their farms and other land. The location, quality, materials, condition, shape and size of their houses and other buildings. You could actually work out what the house looked like, not the design of the house, but you could get a good idea of the shape and finish of the house. You can see the relationship of the buildings and land to each other and to everything around them. And there's all sorts of other miscellaneous information. I said they didn't collect too much information that wasn't essential, but they still wrote down notes on things that struck them as extraordinary or interesting or useful. So you've information on rent, tenure, agriculture, evictions, emigration, family and other relationships, the effects of the famine, the changes in landholding, commercial life of towns. And that is the other thing to remember, that this work took place over the period of the famine. So in counties where you had the work taking place twice, very often you'll have a very large gap. In Donegal, for instance, there's about a 20-year gap in the two periods of work. So one lot of work took place in the 1830s, and the next lot of work in the 1850s, and in between that you had the famine. But the difficulty is that to do research in these documents, you need to put the information together, because they collected the data in separate documents. And so the data is fragmented, and it needs to be put together in the research. And many researchers find this off-putting, because it's slow and tedious, and it can take you a long time. And I'm used to doing this, and I know the examples that I will show you later on, it took me several days to get them to go together. It's helpful to understand the documents, because if you know what's in the documents, you know what to look for in the documents and how that can help your research. You have different information in the two valuations, but slightly different information. It varies from one place to the other. And the detail varies, but it's always worth looking at all of the documents that relate to a particular place. Now, I'm afraid these are not pretty documents. They were made as, even the maps are not, in many cases the maps don't look very attractive, but they were made as working documents, and they were made for other people who are working in that professional area and who are going to understand the technicalities of them. And we always have to remember that it's just fortuitous that these are now valuable for research of all kinds, including genealogy. Now, this is the handout that you have here. This explains the process of the work, which was the same in both valuations. Right, in the townland valuation, the work was in 4 stages. You had field work, office work, the appeals, and then the valuation was established. So the documents that were generated by these phases of work. In field work, you had field books, field maps, and house books. The office work made lots of copies of books. They did calculations. Many of the calculations, because they were working out square area and they were working out the area of houses, many of the calculations would have been done twice by 2 different people to see, just as a check on accuracy. And in the office work, they made a draft valuation list. Now, in the case of the townland valuation, the draft valuation list, because they weren't putting in names, they were just listing the townlands in the parishes in a barony. So they made a very large poster, possibly the size of a large map, that was printed with the valuation, the proposed valuation of each townland, and this would have been posted up in the locality where they were going to hold the hearings for the appeals. And in the townland valuation, it was the parish vestry that appealed. It wasn't, individuals could approach the parish vestry and say, we don't like the valuation of this land. The vestry would appeal, and they held hearings. There were always oral hearings, and Richard Griffith travelled to all these oral hearings all over the country. And out of that, they came up with the valuation that you could still appeal it to, in the same way as you still can now. Well, now you would make an appeal for your valuation to the valuation tribunal, but you could, up to probably 2001, when the law was changed, you could appeal to the circuit court. So in the 19th century, you could appeal to the Court of Quarter Sessions if you didn't like your valuation. And when all of that was over, the valuation was settled, and you had to pay the rate on that basis. So once it was all done, in the townland valuation, they made what they called fair copy. They made documents of record that would be there as the reference. If there were any queries about this, they intended keeping these so they could justify the work that they had done. They made fair copy field books, fair copy maps. It was published in the Dublin Gazette, which was the official it's like the Irisha Figule published by Dublin Castle, and they printed summaries, little summaries in books. In the tenement valuation, you have the same 4 stages of work, except that you have slightly different books. You still have field books, field maps, house books, and tenure books. Tenure books are new ones, where they compiled the information together, because in the tenement valuation you have vastly more information was being collected, especially because they were now, instead of valuing 2 or 3 houses in a townland, they might have 30 houses to value in a townland. So there was greatly more information, the number of records increased greatly in the tenement valuation. And that they actually had to take on a lot of extra staff at this time to deal with all the work and the calculations that they had to do. And the office work was more or less the same. They did the copies, they made their calculations, and out of the office work they produced the primary valuation. Now, many people think the primary valuation, or the printed Griffith's valuation, is the definitive valuation, but it is the document that was produced so that people could see what the valuation was for the appeals. And once it was widely, that's why you can still buy copies of this. They printed maybe 250 or 300 copies of each book, and they were widely distributed to all the local authorities, and they were in the Board of Guardians always got copies, and people could go and look at this, see what their valuation was, and appeal. And so many of the definitive the valuations that are given in the primary valuation are not always the definitive valuation. And they held appeals. Well, there were different kinds of appeals, but appeals were held on this valuation. They did a little bit more work, and then they came to, you could still appeal to the court, and they came to the definitive figure that was on your property, and this was written up in the valuation office in what became known as the council books, because they would renew these books every few years and cancel one book and move on to a new book, and you can still look at all of these books in the valuation office today. And they also made maps, the same thing. They would take the last layer of data from the map, transfer it to a new map, and then use that map for a number of years. So I did two sample searches here based on County Dublin, because we were meeting in County Dublin. Now, County Dublin was one of the places valued only in the tenement valuation. So you don't have the complications of the townland valuation in Dublin, but the documents only start in 1844. And I took a rural area, which was the townland of Shanganagh in the parish of Rathmichael, and for an urban area I took the town of Kingstown. And in the documents for the parish of Rathmichael, you have maps, you have a check house book from 1844, you have an original field book from 1845, an original house book from 1845, a survey book, a tenure book, and the printed valuation. And this is what the books look like. You know, and the large one on the bottom right is the printed primary valuation, Griffith's valuation. And this is I apologise for this. It's a very bad slide. It's yeah. This is better. Yeah, this is printed down from the website, the Ask About Ireland website, where they some of these maps are available now. They're extremely difficult to read. On some of the pay websites, they vary. From sometimes you can read them and sometimes you can't. But this one shows it's the townland of Shanganagh, and in blue I highlighted the holding of General Coburn, whom I'm going to refer to a few times. And you can see there are three maps online for the townland of Shanganagh. It's actually sheet 26 of County Dublin. And this is the printed map that was made in the 1870s. So this will not relate exactly back to, although I think in some parts of the country there were enormous changes between the 1840s and the 1870s. But in Dublin, not so many, I think. But this townland is 700 acres, so it's a big townland as townlands go. And the holding of General Coburn was 154 acres, and he had very high valuation. We'll come to him in a few minutes. And this is, I know this is illegible online, but it shows you what the book looks like. I mean, sometimes they're illegible when you look at the actual document as well. And this is the field book of 1845. It gives the description of the land by quality. And it's technical, but in Dublin it gives the names of the occupiers. Now, in counties valued, in the townland valuation, you don't always get the names of the occupiers, but in Dublin you do. And the description of lot 33 here is a garden, 1 rood, 13 perches at 30 shillings an acre. Now, 30 shillings an acre is quite a high valuation. Like in some parts of the country, it's 10pence an acre. Well, that would be mountainy land. And the highest valuations were the land around Belfast, or the market gardening area of north of Dublin. That land would have been valued maybe up to £4 an acre. And these are statute acres and pounds, money, sterling money. In lot 30A, which is General Coburn's lot, well, the first person is, I can't read his name there, but I know we're going to come back to that. Lot 30A is General Coburn, and he had arable, good, rich, light, sandy, and sharp, gravelly soil. Now you can see this is very technical. I don't know what this means. Some good gravelly clay, somewhat cold, etc. 43 acres at 30 shillings an acre. And in these books you get the houses. You'll see that they will note that there is a house, but they don't give any further details of the house or any valuation on the house. They just note that a house is present, and the information about the house is in another book. And in the field book you'll get other information. You get other, you'll have some smaller holdings where you've no house, where you have, people will have a garden or they have a little farm, and you have the Martello Tower keeps popping up because it appears all over the place, and they still value the land around the Martello Tower. They valued everything. They had no. The fact that it was what later became historic monuments, the Rock of Cashel or Green on Alloch or medieval Ringforth, they had no value as buildings, or it was the agricultural land only they were interested in. So here around the Martello Tower, it appears in both the field book and the house book, as we'll see later, because it was a structure on the land. And the Board of Ordnance didn't pay rates, they were exempt. The government paid a contribution, as they still do, in lieu of rates, but they still recorded the building. And you can see here in the one on the right, you can see here there's a name revised. It was Robert Hopper, and obviously Robert had passed on, and they William had now taken over. And that's the kind of info. You can date the books. You could probably date that by doing another bit of work and tell when William took over that particular farm. You'll see also that there's a lot of renumbering of this. In County Dublin, the renumbering was the bane of everybody's life. They renumbered some things 3 and 4 times. And this is the house book of in Shanganagh. And in the house books they recorded all houses. They gave the occupier's name and description, which is, I'll stand up over here. Yeah, you have the name and description. Then you have a quality letter. But they have this table that shows, you know, I'll come to descriptions based on that. Then they measured the length, the breadth, and the depth of the house in feet. They multiplied they multiplied these together and divided them by 10 to get what they called a measure. And then they had a rate per measure that was based on the quality letter that was given here. So they came up with an initial price for the houses was given here, but then they took other circumstances into account. So we'll see later how they transferred those, how something that was worth one price in the fieldwork became usually worth much higher price later. But from these you can work out what the house was like. Now this is a large house, General Coburn. Now this is quite an extraordinary one. It was a very complex property. There are 4 entire pages of details of General Coburn's house. General Coburn's house was Shanganagh Castle, which I think still exists, no?
Yes.
Yeah. And it was a complex property. It had a study, pantry, tower. Now it had other things as well. These were just bits of the building that they recorded because they were measuring them separately. Water closet, bathrooms, billiard room, beer cellar, no mention of wine. Dairy, workshop, stables, harness room, piggery, fowl house, stores for turf, lumber and potatoes. A greenhouse, grape and orange houses, no less. Some of which were heated with stoves. And it specified that they were covered with glass. Now, Code 1B plus explains that this means a slated dwelling built with stone or brick and lime mortar, not new but in sound order and good repair. And all the other buildings on General Coburn's property were all had this same code, so the whole place must have been in pretty good order. And the square, you could calculate the square area of any house from this. Well, the square area of the external measurements based on the external measurements of the house. And the valuation of the house was £200, which was absolutely staggering. It's enormous, £200. The big houses in Merrion Square were valued at about £100. So for a private house, this is a very large valuation. Well, I suppose it's a castle. This is a small house. John Manning will crop up again. And his house, yes, he's over here. John Manning. His code is 1B again, slated dwelling built with stone or brick, etc. And the main part of his house measures 24 feet by 17 foot 6 by 8 feet. So it's 8 feet high, was to the bottom of the eaves. So that means it was a 1-story house. And so the house measures 39 square metres, which is not enormous. 40 square metres would be the size of a small 1-bedroom apartment now. And he has other buildings, a porch, a shed, a privy. And there's also a note on this page of some of the houses were occupied by labouring men who paid no rent. Now sometimes people doing genealogical research, this is the kind of thing that becomes important in these records. Because if you didn't pay rent, you didn't get through the office process. You were filtered out if you didn't pay rent. They were only interested in because if you didn't pay rent, you weren't liable for the rates. It was the person who owned the building who was going to be liable for the rates. So it was added on to his responsibility. And the name of the person, like somebody like a gardener or a herdsman who occupied a house as part of his work, his name will not appear in the final records, but it may appear in the notebooks. It's more small houses. Here you have the Martello Tower, which is described as a slated dwelling house. I was surprised that the Martello Tower had a slated roof, but maybe it does. Slightly decayed, but in good repair. Wasn't very old at this stage, but I suppose it was 40 years old. And its circumference was 118 by 22 feet. I'm afraid I was completely unable to do that kind of sum. I would have known a long time ago, but not now. And then you have this other person called Myles Byrne, whose code 1A-, slated dwelling house again. 1A- would have been, it was a house that was either substantial or ornamented when it was built. And it is described as in this book as a house and shop. And the main part of the house was 55 feet by 16 feet by 15, so it's a two-storey house. And it's measuring 80 square metres, which is a good-sized house. Now, in rural areas, this doesn't apply to any urban area. They made a second house book. And often this is quite useful and quite interesting. And these are known as the check house books. Although in this case, the check house book was made before the other book. I don't know why, but that's the first time I've ever seen that case. It was made slightly before. But because there could be a 2-year gap in these books, and because a lot was happening in the 1840s, in the 1840s, you can get enormous changes will have happened between the two books, and you'll get different names, and you may get different configurations of properties. And this is General Coburn again, where he gives a different breakdown of the parts of the buildings, and he mentions six greenhouses, and obviously the oranges and grapes struck a chord with the valuators because they mentioned this. And the tenement checkbook, John Manning again. The slightly different explanation of John Manning, and usually what they did was they would average the prices that they came up with. You can see the little notes in red, faded red at the bottom of the entries. And a person called Mrs. O'Neill that I'm going to refer to a couple of times, she had one of the rare, I went right through this book looking for thatched houses. I counted about 60 houses in this parish. Now normally if you were looking at houses in other parts of Ireland, almost every house would be thatched at this time, but it was actually quite hard to find it. There were quite a few farm buildings were thatched, but there were very few thatched houses. But anyway, Mrs. O'Neill lived in a thatched house. And this is a survey book. Because it was very difficult to estimate the size of a very small holding, they got surveyors to go out and measure them with surveyors' chains. And they, in County Dublin, there happened to be quite a number of survey books. These must have been made all over the place, but not very many have survived in other counties. But many of these contain names, and they show the shape of the piece of land, and they often show the exact shape of the house and give the measurements of the house. And this one is Myles Byrne, whom we had earlier. It doesn't give a plan of his house, but it gives the measurements of his property. And this is this is the survey book again, where you have Mrs. O'Neill, you have a little plan of Mrs. O'Neill's house. And and the other one is the Board of Ordnance. Now it's another piece of land that belonged to the Board of Ordnance, somewhere on the coast, and they were involved in a dispute with the person who lived on the land. And then you have the book called the Tenure book, which is the final version that they made before, where they compiled the information together, sometimes at quite an early stage and sometimes after they had done all the other work. It just varies. But it gives a summary of the information, and this was usually, these correspond very well to what's in the printed Griffith's valuation. So you have lot number 27 is Myles Byrne, 31 is Mary O'Neill, and 32 is General Coburn. And then this gets transformed in the primary valuation into the entries that you see there. But in the primary valuation, all you have is the very summary information where you have the name of the immediate lessor, who's the person from whom you held the land. But it might or might not be the owner of the land or the property. It gives the outline, describes the property in very vague terms, and it gives the valuation of the house and the land separately. And in all of these books, you find all sorts of additional information. In the Check House book, there happened to be comments about saying somebody was a shoemaker. I mean, he seemed to be living in the middle of the country, but he was a shoemaker. And then there are other people who were described as general workman to General Coburn, or a general workman living on a farm somewhere. So that could be valuable information. There are all sorts of other comments, such as pays no rent, which was an important one. It wasn't just a social comment that they didn't pay rent, it established the status of the property. Or house down, which means the house was now demolished, or the house was gone. And now there was only, in this book for Shanganagh, there was only one, the book for the whole parish of Rockmichael, in fact, there was only one house down. If you went through a book for Tipperary or anywhere in the West at this time, you'd have pages and pages and pages of house down. It's quite hard to find a house standing in some places. You also have details, like some of these books call Mary O'Neill Mrs. Neal and other, so the names can vary, but if you know her name is Mary, that could be helpful with other records. So sometimes the names will be corrected, as we saw earlier, when another member of the family takes over or somebody else takes over the farm. Or you say the state of the property. This one here is a very bad house, which it must be pretty bad. And documents called Quarto books, which usually these Quarto books are only made for towns, and I'll talk a bit about Quarto books when we come to Kingstown. But there happened to be one for Shanganagh. I'm not really sure why, but this just gives summary information, and it describes people as being a resident lessee. So for the town of Kingstown, what were we doing that time? Towns, there are different type of records for the towns, because you didn't have the second house book, you don't have the field book because it doesn't concern agricultural land, but you have this new book called Quarto book, and you have a house book, but only one house book generally, and it just happens that in Kingstown the house book is in two parts, and you have town plans. This is what the Kingstown book looked like with the primary valuation on the top, and the Quarto book is the one with the marbled paper on the bottom right. This one here, they're kind of slightly different shape. And this is one of the town plans of Kingstown. There are 7 or 8 town plans, but the town plans happen to be, these town plans were all made in manuscript, because you couldn't plot properties in a town on a 6-inch map, so you plotted them on they made enlarged 60-inch or 5 feet to the mile maps for the towns, and you have town plans for about 800 towns. Now places which would hardly, some of them are on crossroads in the country with 5 houses, and they were using a definition of a town that was used for the census, which was revised between 1841 and 51. Any that were made before 1851, they made town plans from very small towns. And some of these are very informative, but some of them, because they had to make a manuscript map and draw a manuscript map, because there were no printed maps of towns until much later in the 19th century, and then they only made printed maps for some towns. They weren't made for every town. It was a lot of trouble to remake the maps, so the maps tended to stay in use for a long time, so that you have an awful lot of scratching out and redoing numbers on the town plans. The town plans were made from 1845. They were made at the same time as they were doing the work in the town. And in theory, they show the houses numbered. They show the houses on plan that are numbered to correspond to the entries in the books. And on this, you have many revisions. So this is a house book for John Leary. This is a house book for Kingstown, which again are slightly different format from the house books in the country areas, because they had to take certain things into, they took other things into account in towns, because they knew that houses in towns were more valuable than houses in the country, and they collected the rent of the houses in towns, even though they claimed that the valuation of the property was based on the measurements and the quality of the property and the location, the local circumstances. They still collected the rents to give them a comparison. And it's the same as the other house books, where you have the description of the property, the measurements that were multiplied together, a quality letter, and the number of measures and the price per measure. And they collected rent information on the gardens, and they would very often make notes in the towns about what especially if it's a shop or any kind of industrial premises, what the building was used for. And this is an example in George's Street Lower, which is very difficult to see, I know, but it shows you what it's like. And number 16 is a business called Francis Martin and Company. It's got a code 1B plus, slated dwelling house built with stone or brick and lime mortar, not new, and good order. It measures 65 feet, which is quite a lot, by 22 by 16 foot 6. So obviously it's 2-story high, and the footprint of the house is 133 square meters, which is a very large property. And this is the same house continues over the page, and the valuator wrote a long note about it. Mr. Martin and Company have a lease of this concern from Robert Meekins, who seems to have been a big landlord in Kingstown. His name was all over the place. It has been repaired, but not thoroughly. This shop or mart is of very inferior construction, slightly put up with a timber roof covered with asphalt felt. Was formerly an old assembly room, now fronted newly and converted into a large shop, mostly unoccupied, and out offices and return are falling into decay. Now, this property, if you had, I started investigating this, but it would actually take quite a lot of work, and I abandoned it. It seems to have changed hands several times over this period. And there's a later note written in this book saying, now converted into 2 shops. And another entry on that page, the lower entry on the former page, is number 17, John Kirkwood. It's a house and 2 shops, code 1B. The usual description. It measured 34, it had a frontage half of his next door neighbour, 34 and 17 by 20 feet high, 2-story building with frontage of 34 feet. And the note is, Mr. Kirkwood carries on, I think it's carries on, should be, on the stationery business in one shop. The other shop in back apartments he has let to a man who follows the saddlery business. And this is the town plan, where you can see the location of the 2 shops. 16 and 17, and you can see 16 is very much, that's very much bigger. And it was amended afterwards, so though that correction could correspond to the time when it's converted into 2 premises. And this is the Quarto book. I mentioned the Quarto book in Rathmichael, where unusually there was one. But because they knew houses in towns were much more valuable than houses in country, the rule was you measured the house, you wrote down the quality letter of the house, and you did the calculation of the basic value of the house, which they called the valuation by tables, because it was literally worked out according to the rule. And then they needed to add the additional value that the house in a town would have compared to the same house in the country. So they did this exercise of working out the relative value of streets. And in Kingstown, George Street had a relative value, because not just, they took into account things like the commercial value of the commercial life of the street, if it was busy, if it was a good place to do business, if it was easy to be there, if it was near other commercial premises, like an isolated shop, as even now, an isolated shop might not be such a good business as somewhere that was on the main street. So the relative value in Georgia Street varied between just over 2 to nearly 5. Now that means that they multiplied the value that they had worked out by tables by this figure, and that gave you the valuation of the house. So you can see here they have, they also put in the names and the additional descriptions, and very often this was done maybe 2 years after they had done the house book, so you could have updated names, you could have new shops, and this is where in these lines here you have the first premises we were looking at, which is now vacant. Part of it is vacant. Robert Meekins is now responsible, he's the owner of it. And you still have Kirkwood, John Kirkwood is still there, John Kirkwood and others, and it's called House, Shops, Office and Garden. And they work, his valuation it was worked out at 40, I have this further on, I think, where they worked out the basic valuation, and his valuation becomes £47 anyway. And in the primary valuation, you see this is the first premises is the numbering has been changed, so it's kind of, you have to work out what the numbers became. This is James Jones and Company. He seems to be the person who also ran the Salt Hill Hotel. And John Kirkwood is still there, and his valuation is now £46. But Jones is still very high valuation of £112, is an enormous valuation. And these are domestic houses. So I took a large house in Longford Terrace. And number 1 and number 2. Number 1 is occupied by Mr. Massey and, I think it's General Massey or Colonel Massey, and number 2 by John Moore. And the code is 1A, very substantial building, finished without cut stone ornaments, slated. And they measured parts, and they give the rate for the house of 2 shillings and 11 pence per measure, which is very high. And General Coburn's rate per measure was 2 shillings. And Mary O'Neill and Manning, whom we looked at in Rathmichael, their rate was 10 pence a measure. So 2 and 11 pence was quite high. But they also, exceptionally, in this book for Kingstown, they put in these little diagrams of the houses and the garden and the, I presume it was the carriage house, the Muse house at the back. And where they also give the first valuation. You can see that the first valuation is low. Massey's first valuation was £26. But by the time they go through all the working out of the additional value and the situation of the house, having a sea view, for instance, which these houses would have had, that was considered a plus, so they put up a valuation, as they would now. And it became, by the time it comes to the primary valuation, this valuation is £92, and Mr. Moore's valuation was £29, and it became £101 by the time they'd done all the sums. And in Longford Terrace, in some of the other houses, there are notes. Number 3 was Mr. Kettlewell. He had to finish some of the internal work, such as papering, painting, etc. And he holds from Mr. Bancroft on a lease of 30 years. Bancroft, and it could be Barcroft, he was a big landlord in Kingstown as well. But there's another house where they give the price of painting and papering the house. Now, I imagine these are enormous big houses in Longford Terrace. As the cost of papering and painting in 1846 was £70. But Major Harrison purchased this house at a bankrupt sale, the property of Mr. Milliken, whom we saw already. He paid £1,000 subject to a yearly rent of £100. The house was finished when purchased. So you have these little extra snippets of information. Now Monkstown Crescent was one that had another of these little sketches, and that is the description of the houses, of the first 3 houses in Monkstown Crescent, and that's the blown up version of it. But it gives you, it shows you the length of the garden, and it gives measurements of the various bits of the buildings, and as well as the name of the people who are living there. And this is the primary valuation, the printed Griffith's valuation, which shows the information on these areas, Longford Terrace and Monkstown Crescent, on 2 separate pages. But again, very summary information. While the printed book is easy to read and it's a good starting point, the information is very summary compared to what you get in the other documents. And this is the town plan that shows Longford Terrace and Monkstown Crescent, and it also shows the ladies' bathing place up here, and the Salt Hill Hotel. There was quite a lot of material on the Salt Hill Hotel, which I remember being at my aunt's wedding there in the late 1950s. I'm not sure when it disappeared.
There's apartments there.
Yeah. But there just wasn't time to include that one as well. So connecting the information, like in Shanganagh you have to connect the maps, the check house book, the field book, another house book, survey book, tenure book, and the valuation. In Kingstown, the town plans, tenement valuation house book, that's in 2 parts. There's, I think one side of Longford Terrace is in one book and the other side is in the other book. So you've got, that's the kind of thing you have to figure out. The Quarto book, the printed primary valuation, but for the towns you will have other sources like directories are very good sources, especially for commercial properties in towns. But very often directories, where you have large houses inhabited by posh people, they'll often appear in the directory as well. So when you put the information together in Shanganagh, I took the Myles Byrne example because General Coburn is a bit obvious. He's so different from everybody else. He's not really a good example. In the check house book, it says Myles Byrne, and it gives all the details of the house, and it says he's an innkeeper, but the innkeeper information isn't given anywhere else. In the field book, it describes it as a house and shop and garden. In the house book, it has the house details, and it says the yearly rent is £40, which is quite a lot, but he has a thatched stable. The house is slated, but the stable is thatched. The survey book gives the measurements of the plot and the garden. The tenure book just describes it vaguely. The Quarto book describes him as a resident lessee with the house and garden. And the primary valuation says that he's got a house, offices and garden. Doesn't mention being an innkeeper or a shopkeeper or anything like that. Some shops are mentioned in the printed primary valuation, but very often they're not. The valuation was £44 and the house was worth £40, so it was a substantial enough house. And in George Street Lower, when you put Kirkwood together, the town plan shows the location, the relationships to the other buildings. It also shows how it was renumbered. Now, the renumbering can be helpful when you're looking at in the books to understand exactly where you are in it, because it could go from being number 1 to being number 10, back to being number 2. In the house book, the house, it tells you you've got 2 shops, a stationery and a saddlery business, gives the details, and the estimated valuation was £13, 14 shillings. The Quarto book describes it as house, shop, offices and garden. Now, office means a non-differentiated outbuilding is what they mean by office. It gets it says gets £20 for the shop and parlour, so obviously that's what he's getting from his subtenant. And his multiplier is 3 plus. Oh yeah, it's a bit more than 3. It was 3 and something I couldn't type into this, something like 3/8 or something. But that gave, by the time you multiply all that together, his initial valuation was £42, which is quite a difference from 13 to 42. And in the primary valuation, it described it as house, shop, offices and garden. and the valuation of £46, including the house of £45. And this is the last slide. So, I mean, just to recap, this is a terrific source. It's amazingly, it's a unique source for 19th century people and property. It has really high quality information. It was collected, it wasn't just people writing up what they thought about places. They were collecting the information in a fairly scientific manner, written down in a uniform manner. You know what to expect when you open these books. Now sometimes you get a bonus in the books in that you get the additional information, sometimes you don't. You have the books everywhere is not covered by every book, but there's a very good rate of survival of these documents, so you're pretty sure of finding something. And it's not like estate records, you know, people love estate records and they're very interesting, but unless the person you're researching happens to have lived on the estate where the records were made, the chances of it are very small, of finding something useful are very small. You've a wide range of the additional information, well, we've discussed that. Now, some of the documents, as you can see, were reused and overwritten, so you've got to look at them, you've got to read them carefully. But the fact that they were continuously updated, and you can search them from the time that the valuation was established up to nearly the end of the 20th century, is quite extraordinary. But they need patience and time, and they are the most rewarding lot of records to look at, and well worth. I hope you will manage to look at them and they will be useful to you. Thank you.
Thank you.